What's the creepiest thing you caught someone doing? Story 1. This actually just happened. I took my daughters, who are 13 and 15, to Disney World a few weeks ago. We were waiting in the security line at the Orlando airport, waiting to come back. If you have never been, the security line at the Orlando airport is extremely long and snakes back and forth forever, so you keep passing the same people again and again. I saw a man, maybe in his 30s or 40s, take out his phone and appear to be texting. But when we went around the next corner, I could see that he was aiming the camera at my daughter, trying to take a picture of her. It only caught my attention because he did the zoom in thing on her legs. I said, "Oh, excuse me, can I help you? It looks like you are having trouble with your camera." Right in his face. He got out of line. I probably should have told security, but my instinct was to get in between them and confront him. Story 2. When we were about 18 years old, my friend Rich was telling me he was being followed by a strange man with long hair, a beard, and a mustache. He said he would turn around and see the man following him from a distance. At night, Rich would look out his front window and see the man standing in the middle of the road staring at his house. 2 weeks later, we finished up our band practice in our lead guitarist's backyard, and Rich left to put his amp in his car. A few moments later, Rich came running back terrified, saying the bearded man was out front and that he was coming through the gate to the backyard. I saw the guy come in and he asked, "Rich?" a few times. Rich asked who he was and he said, "Doug." They had been schoolmates, but Doug had moved away for a few years and grown his hair long. Rich asked him why he didn't say anything earlier, and Doug said he was nervous about approaching Rich because he wasn't sure it was him. So he just followed him for 2 weeks, and Rich was terrified the entire time. Story 3. I went to a homeschool co-op growing up. This kid a few grades behind me, I was in 11th, he was in 8th, I think, always would disappear to the bathroom pretending to use it, but was actually playing Game Boy. His teacher sent me to see what he was doing. I went into the bathroom and immediately he yelled, "Go away! I'm going to the bathroom." I looked under the stall from across the room. His pants, underwear, socks, and shoes were neatly in a pile in the corner. The boy was lying on the floor, facing the toilet with his legs wrapped around the base of it, completely ignoring class. We made eye contact. I went back to class, and his teacher demanded to know what he was doing. I whispered it in her ear after she asked the third time. Somehow I got in trouble for it. I am the one who had to carry that strange image in my head for the rest of my life. Story 4. Let me try to remember a different example, even though I have others too. So our neighbor was out of town for a couple of months and asked us to keep an eye on his property for him. We lived in a rural area with a good view of his entire property from ours. One day, a man in a Jeep rolled up to his place. We watched him step into the property and start walking around, going through things. We drove over there, 4 of us. When we got there, he walked up. We asked him who he was and what he was doing there. He made up some story, asking if a guy by the name of Ron or something was home, not the actual name of the man who lived there. We told him no and asked him again what he was doing there. He said he wanted to buy a truck sitting on the property and that he was a friend of the owner. We asked his name and he said, it's Jeff," like he had to think about his own name. Meanwhile, he had 4 pretty big guys standing around him asking questions, and he was getting nervous. Eventually, he got in his car and left. We called the neighbor and told him what happened, then called the police, who didn't bother to come by. The truck he was rummaging through ended up missing a couple of small parts. 2 weeks later, one morning, we woke up to find his truck, his trailer, 2 jet skis, and his sports car stolen. We called the police and made a report. We later found the jet skis and trailer down the road where they had crashed and left them. The thieves were never caught. Story 5. I went through airport security with my mom, my 2 oldest kids, and my baby son. After we got through taking our shoes off and such, I immediately set up the stroller and put my son in while we put our shoes and jackets back on and gathered our belongings. I was sitting at the very end, gathering my things covered by security, so I faced away from my son for a split second. When I turned back, he was gone. I rushed around looking for him and couldn't find him or the stroller. Security looked at me like I was overreacting, but somehow my child disappeared while they were all milling around. There was no sign of him in the airport. I saw a store and ran in there. Meanwhile, my mom was rushing around with the older 2, and we were completely frantic. There was no help from security because they just seemed not to care. Then I saw a strange older woman with blonde hair pushing him around. At first, I thought she might have been confused. However, she ended up pushing him toward an older man and a younger woman, walking along calmly as though the three of them were together, with my baby. I ran up to them, grabbed the stroller and said, "What are you doing?" None of them pretended to understand what I was saying or English. I reported them, but nothing was done. What struck me as disturbing was the fact that the people she was with acted like nothing was unusual, even though she suddenly had a baby who clearly wasn't with them before. If she had truly been confused, anyone would have asked, "Where did you grab that baby from?" and tried to find the parent. Instead, they casually tried to walk away with him. To this day, I have no idea what their intentions were. It still creeps me out. Whether they just wanted to walk off with a child or something far worse. I don't know what made them think an airport would be a suitable place for that. They weren't in line with us as far as I could tell, so they must have come in behind the barriers in front of security. The fact that they were able to do this with no interference made me worry there might have been something more going on. Story 6. I once had some very strange neighbors who lived in the apartment directly across from mine. The kids were maybe between the ages of 18 and 23, and they were unsettling. I would often walk out and catch them acting overly physical with each other in ways that didn't seem right, very casually while unlocking their door or waiting for their father. But what really creeped me out was one day watching them bring home this large, heavy cabinet or closet. It looked like it weighed a ton. I didn't think much of it at first, just annoyed because they made a lot of noise moving it in. After they brought it inside, though, for about a week straight, I would randomly hear and feel this heavy thumping noise, like someone was taking a sledgehammer to concrete. Since we lived on the bottom floor, my first thought was that they were doing something strange with the floor. After the week was over, I caught them moving the cabinet back out. My mind started connecting dots because a couple of weeks earlier, I had come home to find a young man searching the complex. He asked me if I had seen his friend. He said his friend had come there with the boy next door, and now he couldn't find him. The man looked very distressed. To this day, the whole situation makes my skin crawl. Story 7. When I was in comprehensive school, around 14 or 15 years old, I used to take the bus home at the end of the school day. There was always this unsettling older man who sat in the same seat on the same bus as me every day. I never thought much of it, apart from the fact that he often stared at me. One day there was an empty seat, which was rare since it was usually crowded. The seat was in the aisle next to his. He began a conversation with me across the empty seat about my schoolwork and then started asking when my birthday was, including the year. I found that strange, so I lied and got off the bus earlier than my usual stop. A few days later, I rushed past him to sit at the back of the bus so he wouldn't notice me. He didn't see me, and I felt a bit more at ease. But when I got off the bus, I glanced at the notepad he was drawing in and saw that he was sketching a picture of me. The fake birthday date I had given him was also written on the page. I never took that bus again. Story 8. I was staying at a hotel and walking in from the parking lot when I saw a man creeping around the ground floor rooms that had sliding doors leading to small patios. He was moving from door to door, peeking inside. I froze, ready to call the police, when he realized I was watching him. He quickly apologized for being creepy and explained that he had a parking pass, but the security office had forgotten to write his room number on it. He had gotten separated from his family, who had checked in late the night before and left early that morning for the islands. He said he had dropped them off, gone to the store, and couldn't remember the room they were in, only that it was on the ground floor. He admitted he was taking a chance, hoping to recognize someone through the curtains. I didn't believe him and asked why he didn't just call his family. He showed me that he had called and texted multiple times with no answer. Just then, a door opened further down the row, and a little girl ran out, calling him Dad. I realized he was telling the truth. I told him that in the future, he should go straight to the front desk instead of peeking in windows, because you never know when someone might think the worst and react dangerously. Story 9. I work at a bar. A few months ago, there was this guy we all assumed was homeless, though he sometimes claimed he had a good job working on power lines. One night, while waiting for the bartenders to finish closing, I noticed he had gotten extremely drunk. He started getting in my face, singing along with the jukebox, and trying to hit on me. At one point, right in the middle of a crowded bar, He came up behind me, wrapped his arm around my neck, and started choking me while still singing along. I managed to pull him off, and afterward, he paid his tab and left. Later, when the bar was nearly empty, I was in the office leaving a note. I glanced at the security monitors and saw him pacing outside on the patio. He walked away, then came back several times, ducking behind sheds and even urinating on one of them. The last time he returned, he took one of the patio chairs we had stacked at the entrance, set it down to block the doorway, and just sat there. My coworkers and I whispered to each other in the office, terrified and trying to figure out what to do. I wanted to call the police, but they didn't want to deal with the hassle that late at night. Eventually, we waited until he walked back to the other lot, then slipped out through the emergency exit. The bartenders were parked out front, but I had to go down a dark alley at the back of the building to reach my car. That short walk was one of the scariest moments of my life. Story 10. Not something I personally caught someone doing, but still creepy nonetheless. I live in an apartment with my family that we rent from a sweet older lady. We'll call her Lily. We've known each other for more than a decade and care for each other. One of my chores is to take the recyclables out to the bin in Lily's backyard. There are two gates that keep the backyard closed, one metal decorative gate and one plastic gate with a lock. Lily never locked the plastic gate, though. She told us we could use the backyard whenever we wanted, so whenever I took out the recycling, I would just walk right in. One day, Lily told my dad she needed to share something important. Later, my dad told me and my mom what she had explained. She said that when her sister was a teenager, she had once been kidnapped by an older man. At that time, her sister had eventually been found safe. In fact, she was visiting Lily and staying with her that week. Unfortunately, the same man who had taken her before somehow found out where Lily lived and that her sister was staying there. He came to the house at night and banged on Lily's door, demanding to know where her sister was. Since Lily's apartment door is in the backyard, she immediately started locking the gate after that incident and told my dad not to let me take out the recycling anymore. Story 11. This happened almost 10 years ago. I was hanging out with some friends on a Saturday and decided we'd swing by my apartment to grab my Xbox and a few games. When I walked in, I heard a vacuum running. I went to my room, which had a bathroom attached, and noticed a cord plugged into the wall. The bathroom door was slightly open, and I could see the vacuum inside. Immediately, I thought, what are we walking into? Just then, my buddy came into the room and joked, "Wow, your roommate cleans your place too?" The guy in the bathroom panicked, tossed the vacuum wand aside, slammed the door shut, and turned on the shower. At that moment, we all realized what was going on. We quickly gathered up the Xbox, still in shock and laughing awkwardly, and left. I was so embarrassed for him that I didn't want to go back in case he asked if I saw anything or tried to make up an excuse. But when I got home later, he had packed up all his belongings and moved out. I never saw him again. To this day, I don't know what's funnier, the fact that he had found that vacuum on the curb or that he left it behind when he disappeared. Story 12. I just remembered this when I read the question. Back in high school, I would catch the public bus early in the morning, right around dawn. I wore a Catholic school uniform, but I don't think that was relevant. One morning, while I was sitting at the bus stop reading a book, this was the early 90s before phones, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Without moving my head, I glanced up and saw a man with a wool cap peeking around a tall wooden fence, looking in my direction. Because of the cap, which reminded me of burglars from TV shows, I decided to act like I forgot something, gathered my bag, and walked away from the bus stop. My house was around the next block, and since I knew the alleys and shortcuts, I slipped behind the store on the corner into a narrow alley. From there, I crouched low and peered through a chain-link fence into the yard behind the wooden fence. What I saw froze me. The man with the wool cap was tall, pale, and completely naked, craning his neck around the fence, as if trying to see where I had gone. My heart was pounding. I freaked out and hurried back toward the bus stop, thinking I might miss my ride, but also knowing the bus was due soon. Just as I was about to reach the bench, someone rushed around the corner toward me, and I nearly screamed until I realized it was just a jogger. He wore shorts, a tank top, running shoes, and coincidentally, a wool cap. The relief I felt in that moment was overwhelming. Story 13. I was living in a townhouse-style rental complex when one day, while out on the patio smoking a cigarette, I heard a woman screaming inside one of the units in the building right next to mine. I listened more closely and clearly heard her yell, "No! No! No!" I immediately went inside and called the police to report what I had heard and to say I was concerned for her safety. After the call, I stepped outside again, staying just out of view, to see if I could still hear her, but it had gone silent. As I peeked toward the unit, I saw a man, probably in his mid-20s, come out onto the patio. He wiped sweat from his face, as if he had been working out or overheated, though every unit had central air. After a while, he went back inside, and soon after that, the police arrived and knocked loudly on the door. The next morning, I saw an older couple walking up to that same unit. The young woman I had seen before, likely in her early 20s, opened the door, stepped out, and gave both of them long hugs before they all went inside together. I'll never know exactly what happened that night, but I had a strong gut feeling something was wrong. I was deeply relieved to see her safe the next day, though the whole experience left me unsettled. My roommate friend told me I did the right thing by calling the police, that it may have even saved her life. Still, I never felt the same in that complex again. We chose not to renew the lease and moved elsewhere. Even now, when I think back, I still get a chilling feeling and hope that young woman is okay. Story 14. This one is difficult to recount. Years ago, I lived with a man who struggled severely with his mental health. I had often been homeless, and at the time I was staying with him because I didn't have many options. He would make disturbing claims, like having harmed people late at night after they left bars, and frequently threatened those around him with knives or other objects. His behavior was unpredictable. Sometimes it was forceful physical intimidation, other times bizarre rituals tied to his delusions. He had an obsession with horror imagery and often spoke as if he were possessed. He would binge on all sorts of substances, chasing what he called everything at once, and it only seemed to fuel his darker fantasies. He invited vulnerable people and stray animals into his home, but instead of helping them, he hurt them. He often created the illusion of being friendly, but once trust was lowered, his behavior would escalate, sometimes frighteningly so. There were nights I had to find ways to distract him just to prevent worse outcomes, and other nights I had to hide with others until we could slip away. He damaged nearly everything in his apartment and was eventually banned from local bars for harassing people. Despite all of this, he somehow evaded real consequences, partly because of family connections. His volatility was extreme. He would wake me abruptly, threaten to throw me out if I didn't do as he said, or break things for hours on end. He spiraled between destructive outbursts, delusions of possession, and dangerous fixations. Eventually, I distanced myself, though not everyone managed to get away unharmed. Later, I heard that someone else who stayed with him was seriously injured, and not long after that, I learned he had taken his own life. I can't know how many people were affected by him, but I know it was far more than just me. It remains one of the most disturbing experiences of my life, and even now, thinking about it brings back memories I didn't expect to revisit today. Story 15. I lived with my grandparents for a few years, and they had this neighbor named Pedro who seemed like a pretty nice guy. I had only interacted with him in passing and never thought much of him. He was a few years younger than my grandparents, retired, and usually just hung around his house. One night, pretty late, maybe around 1 in the morning, my girlfriend at the time and I were sitting in her car when suddenly she gasped. I turned to see Pedro very slowly walking across his front lawn toward her car. Before he got too close, he turned left and went toward my grandparents' house, walked up the driveway and around the side of the house. A few minutes later, we saw him coming back around the front, heading up his porch and into his house. 2 or 3 days later, my girlfriend and I were once again parked outside, and he did the exact same thing. I told my grandparents about it, and that's when I learned he made this walk every night. Down his lawn, up the driveway, around my grandparents' house, and then back to his place. On multiple occasions when my grandparents went out of town and I was home alone, I noticed the same thing. If I happened to be up late making a midnight snack, I would peek out the window, and sure enough, there he was. He would walk to the edge of our property, stand there looking around for a while, and then leave. Story 16. I am a musician, and one day I was looking through a stack of tapes. Yes, I am Generation X, trying to find a song I had written. I was popping them into the tape deck, listening for a few minutes, then ejecting them. I put one tape in and pressed play, only to hear our rhythm guitarist talking to himself on the recording. Apparently, he was stalking a girl. He described driving past her house, talked about how beautiful she was, and rambled about wanting to be her boyfriend. It was unsettling. I couldn't understand why such a tape would end up in my studio, inside a cabinet with my recordings. You would think that if you made something like that, you would at least be careful about where you left it. Later that day, some of the other band members came by for practice. I played the tape for them while we sat around, and we were both creeped out and laughing nervously. The guitarist wasn't there at the time, but I left the tape sitting out where he could see it. By the end of practice, it was gone. Story 17. My manager at Taco Bell used to tell stories about a girl who worked with him, but the details were so specific about her private life that it always sounded suspicious. How could he know so much if she was just another employee? At the time, my ex also started working at the same location. We never told anyone we were dating because of the rules. She usually worked evenings and clocked out as we came in, but one day we shared a shift with that manager. We were in the back listening to music and stepped out to smoke in the lobby. When we came back, he had his laptop out and was plugging in small thumb drive devices, transferring files. He didn't notice us, and we didn't think much of it then. About 5 months later, he was arrested after breaking into that girl's house with a gun, a bag of plastic bags, zip ties, and duct tape. When investigators dug deeper, they discovered he had been recording her without her knowledge. Inside her bathroom, in her car, and even by placing cameras inside her home. It turned out Taco Bell also had video evidence of him acting inappropriately outside the building when she was working the drive-thru, and even in the prep area. He had been doing this for over a year, which meant he had footage of all the girls working there during that time. The company ended up paying some people to keep quiet and firing others who refused. It was terrifying to realize how close we all had been to someone doing such disturbing things. Story 18. I manage a team at a thrift store, and at one point we had a very unsettling employee who thankfully no longer works with us. He had a habit of stalking another employee at her other job and constantly tried to ask out nearly every woman who worked in the store, never successfully. We worked in the donation area where customers drop off items, and we would bring everything inside using large cage-like carts. One evening after closing, we were all bringing in carts when some clothing fell off the top of the one I was pushing. Since I was in a rush, I figured I'd pick it up after the other carts were put away. When I came back with another cart, I noticed the creepy employee stop right in front of the small pile I had dropped. He quickly pulled something from the top, sniffed it, and stuffed it into his pocket. Not only was it gross, but it was also against store policy, since no one is allowed to take donated items without buying them first. At first, I didn't want to get him in trouble and hoped he'd correct himself, but he didn't. About 20 minutes later, I confronted him and asked him to empty his pocket. He pulled out what looked like a woman's bra. I don't even want to imagine what he planned to do with it. I regret not filing a report immediately with the assistant manager, but he ended up getting fired later anyway, for pestering nearly every woman who donated items by trying to ask them out. Story 19. One evening I was out with relatives and their friends as they went from place to place. After a short while, we all climbed onto a cart and headed toward a restaurant. When we got off, I noticed a man lingering nearby. I sat down and distracted myself with my phone while the others focused on their own conversation. That's when I became aware of him staring at me. I looked up and gave a polite smile, and he greeted me. I returned the greeting. He started with small talk, asking how I was doing, and then began making comments about my appearance. I simply replied with a brief thanks. His questions quickly crossed the line, and at one point he asked something completely inappropriate, which I ignored. Then he went even further, suggesting that I come over to his place. That was the moment it became unmistakably disturbing. I politely told him no thank you. When I dropped my phone and bent to pick it up, I noticed him acting inappropriately, which made me feel even more uncomfortable. He then made a disturbing comment about my body. At that point, I immediately got up and told my aunt. My aunt, my sister, her boyfriend, and about 14 of their friends were furious and ready to confront him. Just as my aunt's boyfriend went to grab the man, the bartender came outside and told us we had to leave. The whole experience shook me, and I have avoided wearing dresses in public ever since. Story 20. Back when I was at university, I lived in shared halls with 5 other people. The guy in the room opposite mine always gave off strange vibes. One night I fell asleep with a movie playing in my room and accidentally left my door open. At around 2 in the morning, I woke up to find him standing in the corner of my room, silently watching me sleep. Startled, I asked him what he was doing, and he replied, "Making sure you're okay." I asked how long he had been there, and he calmly told me he had been standing there for about an hour, watching me. That was unsettling enough, but there was more. Another time we ordered Domino's. I had some garlic bread, and after eating half a piece, I left the box with the remaining 3 slices on the table while I went to grab something. When I came back, I noticed he had started eating the very slice I had already bitten into, rather than the untouched ones. I told him he could have had one of the fresh slices instead, but he replied that he specifically wanted to taste the one I had bitten. It was one of the creepiest things I had ever experienced. Story 21. I was walking my neighbor's dog like I do every weekday. Since I'm a teenage girl, my mom always goes with me because she doesn't want me out alone. We usually walk about half a mile to a cafe, though we don't buy anything, and then take the trail next to it for an extra half mile. On this particular day, as we were walking down the trail, we saw a man with a dog. His dog was sniffing around in the bushes. I grabbed onto my neighbor's dog's harness tightly because he's a strong puller, and I never let him run up to strange dogs. My mom walked right next to him, so he was squished between us. We kept walking, and after a few seconds, I glanced back. The man had switched to the other side of the trail. I thought it was odd, but didn't say anything. A minute later, I looked back again, and he was suddenly walking in the same direction as us, even though before he'd been going the opposite way. Then when I checked behind me once more, he had switched to the other side of the trail again. It happened a few times, him crossing back and forth, and it really unsettled me. My mom and I quickly decided not to turn back toward the cafe like we usually did. Instead, we went the other way at the end of the trail to avoid having to pass him. When I looked back one last time, I saw him step directly into the bushes, almost disappearing from sight. We never saw him again. The whole encounter left me extremely anxious and fed into fears I was already struggling with. Being afraid someone might try to harm or kidnap me in public, or even break into my home. Story 22. This was the first story that came to mind. When I first met my wife, we were both on dating apps. We met on Tinder. We were just looking for something casual, but it eventually turned into marriage. At the same time, she was also using a site called Meet Me. There was this man who started messaging her constantly. He was a big guy in his late 30s or early 40s, with patchy facial hair, and she was only 21 at the time. She kept blocking him, but every day he would make a new account with a different name, but always the same picture. Eventually, she quit using Meet Me once we started dating seriously, but the man somehow found her on Facebook. Same photo, new name. She would block him, and he would just make another account. This went on for 2 months, literally every day. Finally, I stepped in. I sent him a voice message, threatening to involve the police if he didn't stop stalking and harassing her. He disappeared for about a week, but then he came back again. New name, same picture. Eventually, we moved out of state to live near my parents and help take care of my dad. After relocating, the messages finally stopped. I guess he either gave up or couldn't find her again. I was beyond relieved when it ended. Story 23. I've probably been someone's unintentional horror story a few times. I've never been great in social situations, and I have a few medical conditions that can make me come across as unsettling without meaning to. The most obvious ones are that I have a strong light sensitivity, so I tend to turn off the lights in almost any room I'm in. On top of that, I have ADHD and autism, and my vocal stimming usually comes out as singing. Put those together, and I often end up singing alone in dark rooms. Since I'm in college and usually arrive to classes early, more than one student or professor has walked into a pitch-black room only to hear a quiet female voice singing from the back. To make things even stranger, when I'm nervous, I sometimes use older, formal speech patterns. One time a guy walked in on me mid-song and nervously said, "Oh, well, let me get the light for you." Instead of just replying, "Thanks," I blurted out, "Don't worry, the darkness was my doing." I didn't mean it to sound so eerie, I was just panicking. So if that guy ever happens to read this, I'm genuinely sorry for scaring you. I was just extremely nervous and not expecting anyone to show up that early. Story 24. This one isn't about me. but about an ex-girlfriend of mine who had a terrifying experience that luckily didn't end worse than it did. She was at a party and was offered a joint. Since she was dating a low-level dealer at the time, she didn't think twice about smoking. But as she inhaled, she turned to her friend and said, "Catch me." The joint had been laced, and she thought she was going to die. Her friend carried her to a bedroom and stayed with her, making sure she stayed conscious. After a while, she was able to communicate that she was okay. She couldn't move, but she was aware of everything around her and was starting to feel a bit better. At some point, her friend went to grab her a drink. When he came back, he found two men in the room attempting to pull her jeans off. She was conscious enough to know exactly what was happening, but couldn't physically defend herself. Realizing what was going on, her friend calmly told them that it wasn't a good idea to try to take advantage of a defenseless girl. They brushed him off, asking, "What are you going to do about it?" He quickly said, "Me? Nothing. You're obviously bigger and stronger than me." But her boyfriend is, he gave the name of her low-level dealer boyfriend, who had a reputation for being violent. And if he finds out what you're doing, you're probably going to end up floating in the river. That was enough to scare them off. They left, and her friend stayed with her for the rest of the night to make sure no one else tried anything. It was one of those moments that could have turned into a complete nightmare, if not for her friend's quick thinking. Story 25. This isn't exactly me catching someone doing something, but it was one of the creepiest things that has ever happened to me. I used to work downtown on a famous bar strip, and I often left really late or really early, depending on how you look at it. One night around 3 in the morning, I was walking to my car parked under an overpass. That area was known for having a lot of homeless people and some sketchy individuals wandering around. There was a single dim light above where my car was parked, and I noticed two figures standing near it in the distance. I kept my knife in my pocket just in case. As I got closer, they appeared to walk away. Relieved, I got into my car. But before I could even process it, two people suddenly slipped in, one into the passenger seat and the other into the back. I didn't know them at all. They looked like substance addicts, sweating, speaking rapidly, and fidgeting nonstop. My heart raced. I didn't know if they were armed, and though I had my knife, I doubted I could take on both of them. The strangest part was how normal it all seemed to them. They acted like this was totally fine, like they had just gotten into a friend's car. They even misidentified me as someone they apparently knew. I tried to explain that I wasn't who they thought I was, but they didn't react or get out. Instead, the woman in the passenger seat asked me to drive them to their guy. I assumed she meant a dealer. Meanwhile, the one in the back stayed silent, grinning in this unnerving way while fiddling with a bag. Against every shred of common sense, I went along. The woman directed me through some rundown streets, deep into a rough part of town. I was in full panic mode, my adrenaline pumping, terrified about what might happen. Finally, as we neared a bus stop where a lone figure was standing in the dark, the woman told me to pull over. They got out casually, without a word of thanks, and vanished into the night. I could have been robbed or worse. That night stuck with me, and ever since, the first thing I do every time I get into my car is lock the doors. Story 26. My wife and I were on vacation in Italy, riding a train near Verona. Two young women were sitting across the aisle from us, side by side. A middle-aged man got on, wearing a bulky jacket. He was sweaty, jittery, and drinking a can of Coke. He sat directly across from the girls, uncomfortably close, and immediately fixed his stare on them. My wife and I whispered about him because he looked off, wild-eyed, mostly bald with messy hair, and clearly agitated. We decided to keep an eye on him. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of a can being crushed and something clattering like it landed among other cans. I glanced up, but instead of tossing it away, he had pulled out another Coke and popped it open, still staring at the girls. My wife noticed too. Then after finishing that one, I saw him crush it, open his shirt collar, and drop it inside. It clanked as if it landed on a pile of other cans. He then reached into his half-zip jacket and pulled out yet another Coke. He was sweating profusely, gulping them down one after the other. The girls were visibly uncomfortable, exchanging nervous glances. One of them looked back at the rest of the train car, caught our eyes, and we all shared a silent, "This is not right" moment. I subtly motioned with my eyes toward empty seats further back. Within moments, the girls got up and moved. The man stayed put, continuing to chug sodas while staring. In total, he drank 4 full cans in about half an hour, plus the one he was finishing when he boarded. By then, he was drenched in sweat, jittering, and still fixated on the girls' empty seats. My wife and I quietly discussed what we would do if he followed them, or us, and even planned out what we could use to defend ourselves. Finally, he stood up. Our hearts jumped, but instead of moving toward us, he turned and exited the train. As he walked, it literally sounded like a recycling bin rattling around inside his jacket. The girls looked back at us, and we all shared a relieved laugh. It was one of those bizarre, unsettling encounters that left us shaken, but thankful it ended without incident. Story 27. This one wasn't terrifying, but it was definitely unsettling. When I was about 21 or 22, one of my buddies had parents who secretly followed us around town, and even on trips without us knowing. We only found out one day when a group of us took a day trip to the lake, which was about an hour away. He came from a town roughly 50 miles away, and his parents lived there too. About halfway to the lake, he thought he recognized his parents' car about 300 feet behind us on the highway. To be sure, he slowed down a little, and yes, it was them. It was really odd because his parents were extremely private people and rarely ever went out, let alone followed anyone. They had always been strange, very plain and uptight. So my buddy decided to take an exit to try to shake them, but they followed right along. Eventually, he sped up and made a few turns to lose them, which worked for the moment. But almost immediately, his dad started blowing up his phone, scolding him for speeding. Then, as if that wasn't enough, his dad demanded to be put on speakerphone and started giving us orders to reveal our exact location so he could perform a search. His dad was a police officer and definitely played into that authority mindset, but it was ridiculous. We had nothing to hide. We weren't doing anything illegal, just hanging out, but it wasn't his right to treat us like criminals. We told our buddy to just drive us home, and the entire way back, his parents continued to harass him with calls, acting like we were fugitives. When he finally got home and confronted them, they admitted they had been secretly stalking us for the last 4 to 5 months because they were suspicious about what we were doing in Reno, Nevada. The irony was that we weren't doing anything but listening to music and skateboarding. After that, we refused to ride in our buddy's car again if his parents were involved. And we made it clear to them that we were not their children and they had no control over us. Thankfully, they backed off after that. Story 28. I was volunteering at the fire department one night, and I happened to be the only female on the crew. The station was an old firehouse, so the bunk rooms didn't have locks. I went to bed, choosing the bed next to the door. Being a light sleeper, I woke up to the sound of footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and one of the new volunteers stepped inside. He just stood there in the moonlight, watching me. I pretended to stay asleep, but shifted slightly, acting like I was rolling over. That spooked him, and he left. I got up, hid behind the lockers, and tried to call one of the guys for help. Nobody answered. I quickly put on pants and steel-toed boots, then went out into the hallway, where he was just standing there. I confronted him, and to my shock, he pulled out a knife and held it to his neck, threatening to hurt himself. I said, "Go ahead." He started crying, hitting himself in the face, calling himself an idiot. But then he stepped closer and said, "Nobody will know if I strangle you." I stayed calm and told him, "Obviously, you've never watched the ID channel." He started crying again. I tried to get past him, but he blocked me. That's when I started yelling at the top of my lungs, "Stranger danger! Stranger danger!" over and over. Finally, the guys came out of their rooms and the man bolted, running away. He was banned from the department, but unfortunately, he continued hopping between volunteer fire departments. To this day, the memory of him standing over my bed in the dark, then threatening me in the hallway, still gives me chills. Story 29. When I was about 7 years old, I spent hours outside playing in my backyard, running through sprinklers, swimming in the pool, or swinging on my swing set. Our house backed up to a row of small apartments built above little shops. That summer, I noticed a man in one of the upstairs windows, always with binoculars pointed directly into our yard. At first, I tried to ignore him, telling myself he must be watching birds. But then he started calling out, "Hey, little girl." Sometimes I would hear him making strange noises while still glued to the binoculars. In my young mind, I thought maybe he was just a weird man with some kind of problem. One day while my dad was mowing the lawn, I told him innocently, "My friend up there likes to watch birds with his binoculars. He yells to me all the time." My dad froze and asked, "What friend?" I explained everything to him. The very next day, my parents told me to go outside and play as usual, but they stayed inside, quietly watching. Suddenly, my dad and a few other men from the neighborhood rushed over to the apartments and dragged the man out. Years later, my mom told me that my dad and his friends beat him up. Things were handled differently back in the 1970s. Kids weren't always believed, but thankfully my parents trusted me and acted. The neighborhood drove the man away, though sadly he probably reoffended somewhere else. Even after 50 years, I still remember the whole thing vividly. Story 30. When I was 16, and again at 17, I was followed home by the same person. Both times after stopping at the same gas station around 3 in the morning. Each time, I would get gas and a snack, and then as soon as I got into my car, the only other car in the lot would start up and follow me. The first time, I wasn't entirely sure until I noticed him sticking with me, even after I turned onto my quiet, dead-end street where only locals ever went. Terrified, I doubled back to the gas station, told the cashier I was being followed, and asked if I could wait inside until he left. The second time, I recognized the pattern right away and realized it was the same person. This time I was more angry than scared, though still shaken. I foolishly pulled into my driveway, and he stopped just behind our mailbox. Fueled by adrenaline, I grabbed my pepper spray and stormed toward his car. Another reckless choice. He rolled down his window and just stared, eyes glazed, clearly high on something. Then he made a deep, gurgling noise, licked his lips, and slowly drove away. A week later, I saw his face in the news. He had been arrested for attacking a 13-year-old girl on her way home from school. The thought that he had targeted me twice before still chills me to this day. Story 31. In this case, I was the creepy one without meaning to. After returning from a trip to Canada, I live in Australia, jet lag hit me hard. I ended up napping at odd hours since my flight had arrived early in the morning. One day, while I was in a deep, confused sleep, my mom came in to wake me for lunch. She later told me that I suddenly sat bolt upright in bed, eyes open, and stared straight at her before turning my gaze to a blank wall. Without saying a word, I climbed out of bed, walked over to the wall, and stared at it like I was hypnotized. My mom panicked, called my name just as I reached out to touch it. I snapped out of it, disoriented but aware that I had actually been doing those things. I just had no control. What I thought I had seen was a shelf on the wall, even though I knew no shelf existed there. I must have been sleepwalking or hallucinating from exhaustion. It wasn't until my mom told me how terrifying it looked from her perspective that I realized how creepy it had been. The good news is I don't hallucinate furniture anymore when I'm tired. The bad news is that now, when I'm overly exhausted, I hallucinate spiders instead. Story 32. When my now husband and I were dating in high school and college, we spent a lot of time in New York City. Since he was born there and had plenty of friends and family, we always had a place to stay and food to eat. As broke kids, all we really needed was a ticket, and we were set. One spring break, his college friends were in the city for a school-sponsored trip, and we went up too. Not with the group, but to hang out with them and see family. Late one night, we were entering a train station near Battery Park when we turned a corner and froze. Right there in the tunnel leading to the turnstiles was a man, naked from the waist down, wearing only an "I Love New York" shirt pulled up over his stomach. He stood there with a vacant, thousand-yard stare, methodically touching himself. There were no pants in sight, nothing to suggest he'd even planned to cover up. I happened to be first in line. I glanced at him, said nothing, and quickly swiped my Metro card, heading through the turnstile to the platform. My husband and our friends weren't so lucky. They froze in visible panic, fumbling with their Metro cards just a few feet away from the man. I'll never forget the look on their faces. 3 startled college students trying to escape as quietly as possible while he stared blankly, locked in his disturbing ritual. Watching from the platform, I was shaken too, but mostly relieved that I'd trusted my instincts to just move quickly past him. Story 33. This happened during my freshman year of college. I didn't know anyone yet. I was brand new in town. As I walked up to my dorm with a suitcase in each hand, a girl in a school polo approached me. The shirt identified her as part of the orientation team. She raised a large camera and took several pictures of me. I assumed it was for the yearbook, so I stopped, smiled, and kept going. I checked in at the desk, picked up my room and dorm keys, and did all the orientation stops to collect my paperwork and class registration schedule. Then I headed to my room, dropped off my bags, and spent the rest of the day moving in. Later, I went down to the cafeteria, met some people, and even made a few friends. By Thanksgiving, I was more settled in. The girl with the camera, who turned out to be a junior and an RA in my dorm, had become a friend too. One night she invited me to her room. I don't remember the exact pretext, but it wasn't for studying. As we got close to her door, she suddenly started acting strange, nervous and jittery. When she opened the door, I instantly understood why. Covering her massive closet doors, floor to ceiling, were photos of me. Not just one or two, dozens. They weren't for the yearbook at all. She had followed me that first day and photographed everything. Me getting my key, my orientation paperwork, my class schedule, even shots of me hauling stuff from my car and eating in the cafeteria. Beyond that, there were pictures from random days. Me walking back to my room in just a towel after showering, me playing sports, at events, in the art studio, even candid shots of me in the hallway. I stood frozen, staring in shock for what felt like minutes. She blushed bright red, trembling as she rushed to apologize. She tore the photos down, shoved them into my hands, and told me I could keep them. I muttered something about taking them back to my room and left as quickly as I could. After that, we remained polite in passing, since I saw her almost daily in the dorm. But I always kept conversations casual and from a safe distance. It was one of the most unsettling experiences of my college years. Story 34. A friend and I used to go urban exploring when we were young teens, basically sneaking into abandoned and derelict buildings. My friend was much more invested in it than I was. He would take old plaques and paperwork home, and he was part of an online forum dedicated to urban exploration in our area. One day we went to explore an old manganese bronze factory. We were walking down a long, dim hallway when we suddenly heard strange noises coming from one of the many rooms nearby. We froze, unnerved, and decided not to find out who or what was making the sounds. Instead, we quickly climbed through a broken window to get outside. My friend went first, then I followed. Just as I made it through, my friend turned to say something to me and screamed. I spun around, and standing only 3 feet away was a skinny, pale man with short ginger hair. He asked us for a smoke. We told him we didn't smoke, and he casually said, "Thanks anyway," before climbing back inside the building. At the time, it was creepy, but we just brushed it off as another odd encounter. A couple of weeks later, though, my friend found out through the online forum that the same man had been found dead the very next day. He had apparently fallen through the ceiling while trying to strip copper wiring from the roof. We were only 13 or 14 years old, and realizing how close we had been to him right before his death left a deeply unsettling feeling that stuck with us for years. Story 35. I often ride a local trail near me, and I've seen some strange things there. One evening around 6:30 or 7, while it was drizzling and the trail was almost empty, I noticed a brand new black Tesla pull into the parking area as I started my ride. I didn't think much of it and continued down the trail. After a while, I circled back toward the parking lot and headed into one of the forested trails before it got too dark. This particular trail runs along a small ravine and eventually leads to a unique blue pond. The water has this distinct metallic blue color, probably caused by some mineral, though no one seems to know exactly why. As I passed by, I noticed a man crouched near the pond's edge. At first, I thought he was just playing in the water, but then I realized he was carefully filling glass jars and plastic bottles with it. He didn't even glance at me. I kept riding, avoiding eye contact, because the trail dead ends and I knew I'd have to pass him again. I've often seen fish in that pond, brightly colored, catfish, even once a small alligator, but never someone harvesting the water. On my way back out, I saw the man again in the parking lot, loading his bottles into the trunk of his Tesla before driving away. It was bizarre. If he'd been collecting water for environmental testing, he would have been in uniform and taken it straight to the nearby environmental center. If he wanted fish, he could have just caught them directly. To this day, I have no idea what he was doing. Another time on the same trail, I experienced something equally strange. On a different section, I rounded a corner and saw a girl suddenly emerge from the forest. She was fully dressed, backpack, makeup, hair styled in a punk/goth look, and carrying a skateboard. The weird part was that there wasn't a trail or any clear opening in that area, just thick forest. She stepped out of nowhere, put her skateboard down, and casually started riding in the opposite direction. It left me shaken, wondering where on earth she had come from. Story 36. This wasn't exactly me catching someone in the act, but it was one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. When I worked for the parks department, I was mowing one of the parks along a bike path that connected several others. In one of the parking lots, I noticed a Mercedes with shattered glass on the ground nearby. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Just assumed it was a broken window, maybe even caused by one of our mowers. Later, on my way back to the shop after finishing my route, I decided to check it out just in case. I figured I'd find an empty vehicle and report the damage to my supervisor. Instead, the moment I got close, I was hit with the unmistakable smell of gunpowder. My stomach dropped. When I peered inside, I found a man who had taken his own life with a shotgun in the back seat. I won't go into graphic detail, but the scene was devastating. I called it in, and after speaking briefly with the police, I learned he had been the owner of a large veterinary business. He had left a note explaining that his wife was divorcing him. It was one of the worst days I've ever had. The experience stuck with me so much that coworkers began calling me the Parks Department coroner, because that was just the first of 3 bodies I would end up finding during my short time working for the city. Story 37. This one is still ongoing, and it's unsettling. I have a coworker I genuinely enjoy talking to, so I gave him my number, thinking it was just on a friendly level. I sometimes forget that, as a woman, giving your number to a male coworker can easily be misinterpreted. At first it seemed fine, but soon he started asking me weird, sexual questions. I told him directly that I'm asexual, aromantic, and not interested in any kind of intimate relationship, but that I was willing to answer questions about my identity. After that, he stopped texting for a while, and I wondered if I had said something wrong. Then months later, he asked if he could start texting again. I agreed, hoping to keep things on the same friendly, platonic level we had at work. But it didn't take long before he brought up shul topics again, the very thing I had already told him I wasn't comfortable with. I deflected, avoided answering directly, and eventually just slowed down my responses. Part of that is also because I'm extremely busy. I tend to sleep long hours and I'm introverted outside of work, so constant texting feels overwhelming anyway. But the bigger part is that his messages make me uneasy. I want to be friends, but the nature of his texts makes me wonder what he might try if we were ever alone together outside of work. At one point, he started talking about paying women for explicit photos. I tried to redirect the conversation, mentioning the online furry art community and how consensual transactions like that are not shameful. I was trying to normalize the topic without engaging personally. But when he pushed again, I reminded him of my asexual identity and told him flat out that I would never send that kind of picture to anyone. I thought that was the clearest, kindest way to draw a line. Still, he hasn't quite gotten the message. I don't know how to handle this without being harsh and scaring him off completely, because I really would like to stay friends. But he needs to learn how to talk to women, or at least to people with feminine bodies, without crossing those boundaries. Right now, I'm just hoping he picks up on my lack of engagement and finally respects where I stand. Story 38. One morning we woke up to find nails hammered into the fence we shared with our elderly neighbors. Our cat often climbed along that fence, so we immediately assumed the nails were put there to keep the cat away. My parents went next door to ask about it, and the couple admitted that's exactly what the nails were for. Later that day, while I was sitting at the table doing homework with my dad nearby, I happened to glance out the glass door. The nails were gone, but the old woman was standing there with her head just above the fence, staring directly at me. I had never seen such an intense, angry expression in my life. I stared back for a moment, unsettled, but she didn't look away. At some point, I turned back to my homework, and when I looked again a few minutes later, she had vanished. We've barely spoken to them since. They still live there. And every so often, little passive-aggressive things happen, like leaves from their garden mysteriously being dumped over the fence into ours last autumn. I don't know if something's wrong with her or if she's just mean, but that look she gave me that day will always stay with me. Story 39. While on an exchange program in Japan, my friend and I shared a dorm room. Everything was fine at first, until we met a guy who instantly gave off unsettling vibes. He never said much, but he would stare at my friend from a distance, watching her in this way that felt like stalking. One night, I woke up in shock because I swore I heard his voice right next to me. It was probably a sleep hallucination, but it shook me badly. The next morning, on the way to class, we saw hundreds of crows gathered watching us. It only added to the dread. Things got much worse when we found out this man had convinced the staff to let him move into our building, lying that he was close friends with us. My friend broke down crying. We immediately asked to be moved, and thankfully the staff agreed. They later told us we weren't the first ones to complain. He had multiple complaints from other girls, and even a history of problems back in his home country. Looking back, I know we absolutely made the right call to leave. The crows, the hallucination, and then him moving in, it was all too much. Story 40. I once had a very unsettling experience in a public restroom. Another person walked in right after me. At first, I thought nothing of it. They simply headed toward a stall as I did. But as I was halfway through, they took a small step closer. I moved aside to give them space, but they stepped closer again. Before I knew it, they were right up against me, crossing the unspoken boundary of personal distance. I gave them a slight shove, and they backed off, only to step forward again and rest their head against my arm. I pushed them away more firmly and they returned to their stall, this time actually using it. Then, without warning, they placed a hand on me in an invasive way. That was the final straw. I shoved him into the stall beside me and told him that if he ever did that again, someone was going to hand him his ass on a silver platter. He went back to pretending to finish, but then either tried to grab at me again or shove me. At that point, I'd had enough. I physically stopped him, then dragged him straight down to the nurse's office and told her he was being a creep in the bathroom, I wasn't having it, and I have a math quiz to take, so yell at me later. That was the end of it. His family ended up moving afterward. My parents got a call, but I didn't get into any real trouble. Story 41. About 5 years ago, I was working as a bartender. Sunday afternoons were my regular shift, the slowest, least profitable shift unless it was football season. On this particular Sunday, it also happened to be my mom's birthday. After lunch with her, I went to work around 5 p.m. The bar had the usual handful of regulars, plus 2 middle-aged women I hadn't seen before. At the far corner sat a scrawny man in his mid-50s who I'd only seen once or twice. For the sake of the story, let's call him Shady Gary. He looked off that day, but I kept doing my rounds. A little while in, I heard someone moan. It was faint, and no one seemed to react, so I brushed it off. 10 minutes later, the 2 women flagged me down. They quietly told me that whenever I turned away, Gary was staring at people around the bar, including them and me, and touching himself. They said the moan I'd heard was him finishing. My stomach dropped. I'd only been bartending 6 months and had no idea how to handle something like this. Shocked and creeped out, I decided the best thing was to make it public and humiliating, so he couldn't come back. I walked right up to him and said I knew what he was doing. I told him he had 1 minute to leave and never come back. He looked at me like I was insane, asked if it was a joke, then asked if he could at least finish his drink. I didn't say a word, just stared. After a few seconds, he shrugged, stood up, and walked out, his pants visibly stained down the front. In hindsight, I should have called the police, but in the moment I was too shocked, acting purely on instinct. To make matters worse, it all happened on my mom's birthday. It's still one of the most disturbing things I've ever experienced behind a bar.